How is it that we find ourselves surrounded by such complexity, such elegance?
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.
Hi, you're listening to DNA Today, a multi-award-winning podcast and radio show where we discover new advances in the world of genetics. From genetic technology like CRISPR to rare diseases to new research. For over a decade, DNA Today has brought you the voices of leaders in genetics in over 200 episodes. For the past 3 years, DNA Today has won the People's Choice Best Science and Medicine Podcast Award. I'm Kira Dineen. I'm a certified genetic counselor and your host.
Hi, you are listening to DNA Dialogues, where we dive into the intricate world of genetic counseling research. I'm Kate Wilson.
I'm Kalita Leopold.
I'm Naomi Wagner.
And we are your co-hosts. Join us as we peel back the layers of groundbreaking articles from the Journal of Genetic Counseling, bringing you exclusive discussions with the authors themselves.
Each episode sparks a vibrant exchange, exploring the latest discoveries, ethical dilemmas, and technological advances that are shaping the future of medical genetics.
From navigating complex testing decisions to building trust with diverse communities,
listen in as we unpack the science, challenge assumptions, and celebrate the human connection at the heart of genetic counseling research.
So grab your headphones, unravel the double helix, and prepare to be captivated by the array of voices in DNA Dialogues, a podcast where the blueprint of life meets intimate human conversation. Welcome to DNA Dialogues. As we look ahead to Pride Month 2024, we are diving into 2 articles that explore gender-inclusive and gender-affirming care. You can find these articles in a special virtual issue of the Journal of Genetic Counseling on the topic of LGBTQIA+ issues in genetic counseling. This special virtual issue is free and open access for the month of June. You can find the Journal of Genetic Counseling webpage via onlinelibrary.wiley.com or via the National Society of Genetic Counselors website. Check out the episode notes for the link to this special virtual issue.
Hi, I'm Kate Wilson. My pronouns are she, her. I am talking with Heather Motiff, whose pronouns are she, her, about their recent Journal of Genetic Counseling paper titled Use of Gender-Inclusive Language in Genetic Counseling to Optimize Patient Care. Heather Motiff is a board-certified genetic counselor who currently works as an oncology genetic counselor at SSM Health Cancer Care in Madison, Wisconsin. She is passionate about ensuring everyone has access to inclusive, quality healthcare and genetic services. So thank you for being here today, Heather.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So why don't we get started? You tell us a little bit more about the study. So how did you decide to choose this topic, or what kind of led you to select this topic for the study?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people, I have family and friends who I love dearly that have been, treated poorly and face discrimination in, many areas of their life just because of who they are. So after I had kids and I returned to work at a federally qualified healthcare center, and I started engaging in some advocacy work in my community and school district, I just regularly began to meet people who endured injustices, not only in their communities and schools, but in their healthcare as well. I was, talking with patients every day who just matter-of-factly relayed these experiences, demonstrating that these, huge disparities in healthcare can really be deadly. And I just wanted to give my patients an opportunity to come to a provider that was compassionate and understanding, and most importantly, inclusive to try to improve, their health outcomes. So I've worked in healthcare most of my life since I was 15. But it wasn't until I worked in this FQHC that I really saw firsthand just how inequitable care is for so many people. So when I started grad school, I already knew kind of what I wanted the focus of my research to be. And that was related to, the inequities in or just accessing genetic counseling. So I initially wanted my focus to be on transgender and non-binary patients' perspectives about their experiences with genetic counseling. But as I, learned more about the research process and did my literature search and met with my mentors, that just really seemed to be more difficult for me to do in that limited time and resources I had in grad school. So I just shifted my focus to gathering data about not only how genetic counselors convey this inclusivity to patients, but if they're not using inclusive language, what are their reasons? Just thinking if we know what those barriers are that genetic counselors have to providing gender inclusive care, then we can start to address those. So kind of a roundabout way of getting here, and maybe the easier route of not doing those patient perspectives. I hope somebody can kind of pick up where I left off on that has some more time available.
Yeah, it's always good to call out, where there's some other areas of exploration or other opportunities for study. And that's one of the things, though, it's exciting to be able to do the work, in the master's program, but at the same time, you have less than 2 years. So sometimes it is a bit of a challenge to do large scope types of things. So I appreciate that you were coming in background being at the FQHC and then wanting to look at access, but also more inclusive practices. So in your study, since you looked at the genetic counselors' use of gender inclusive language, are there examples that you can give us on what gender inclusive language is, or some of the terms, that you have seen clinicians use that's inclusive?
Yeah, so I think we often use gendered language in appointments when we are talking about, members of somebody's family or specific body parts that not everybody has. So in our study, we asked how often genetic counselors used more gender inclusive terms. So instead of things like mom or dad or women and men. So some of the terms we asked about using were sperm and egg or parent instead of mom or dad when discussing things like inheritance or explaining inheritance, or using assigned female or male at birth or individual with or without a Y chromosome when we're describing health risks. We're thinking about for cancer specialty, we asked those genetic counselors, saying a person with breasts or ovaries or a prostate when we're talking about those cancer risks, instead of saying, women and men have XYZ risks. So we found like the most common gender inclusive terms that people use were when they were talking about families. So almost all, over 90%, said that they use spouse or partner frequently. They used children very often and things like parents and siblings. A lot of people also use that unaffected or affected individual instead of, specifying what that gender of that person was. The things that we found were used the least often were actually assigned female or male at birth, and then that individual with or without a Y chromosomes. I don't know if that feels less personal for people. I'm not really sure, but only about 18 and 21% of people reported using those frequently. And we also didn't find that someone's age or even their specialty was correlated with their frequency using these gender inclusive terms, except prenatal genetic counselors were more likely to use sperm or egg. So that makes sense, I guess, in the context of their specialty. So those are just some of the things we asked about.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you found out a good deal about kind of current practices and language that people are using. But one of the things too that you looked for was comfort. So about how comfortable were the people you surveyed when using gender inclusive language?
Yeah, so the survey found that a lot of the genetic counselors were comfortable. About 2/3 reported that they were, very comfortable using this gender inclusive language. And then a little over half reported that they were frequently using it. So unsurprisingly, those most comfortable with using it were using it more often with patients. They were most uncomfortable, though, asking patients their pronouns and sharing their own during appointments. But they were comfortable asking on like intake or health history forms. Same kind of thing here, specialty, age. And also we looked at, if they were a racial or ethnic minority, if they reported that was not correlated with using gender inclusive language more often or being more comfortable with it. In our study, only 2 individuals reported their gender as non-binary, and then only 2 individuals identified as transgender. So we didn't feel we could determine, if there were any correlations with gender and then that comfort or frequency using that inclusive language.
So, so you mentioned that a lot of times the genetic counselors were not necessarily sharing their own pronouns. or they felt comfortable asking patients for their pronouns more on like an intake side versus within the appointment side. What are some possible implications for this finding? Like how, if any, would this impact the patient-provider communication?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this in the discussion in my paper. Misusing a patient's pronouns or misgendering somebody can leave patients feeling, really misunderstood or marginalized even further. So if patients don't feel like they can trust us or the information that we provide, we're just widening that gap and accessing these genetic services even further. So I think, sharing pronouns and asking patients theirs is one of those first opportunities we have to indicate that inclusivity to them. So other studies have shown that this can be an important way to demonstrate that inclusivity to transgender patients. Yet less than 10% of genetic counselors in our study frequently asked patients their pronouns, and only about 15% shared their own. How often they asked or shared their own, was not correlated with their comfort, their reported comfort level or frequency using this inclusive language. And then the majority, as over 60%, thought it was less important to even ask patients pronouns during the appointment. So that was kind of interesting. But 75% did think it was important on intake forms. So to me, this really does indicate they likely understand the importance of using correct pronouns with patients, but they're clearly uncomfortable, asking or sharing face to face. So, for whatever reason, we aren't asking and we're just assuming a person's gender identity is within this binary of male and female. We can, again, further marginalize people who don't fit in that binary. So I just think being very aware of that and trying to get that information in some way is going to be really important to do if you're not asking in the appointment.
Right. And I don't know if your study got too far into why some folks were not necessarily including this in the session themselves, or if you found why even somebody that might feel comfortable with it wasn't necessarily bringing it up during the session.
Yeah, we didn't ask some specific questions about this, but kind of later when we were asking for reasons for not using inclusive language, some people were reporting they got a lot of pushback from patients. When they did that, it was kind of harming rapport right off the bat. Somebody had even reported a personal attack when they disclosed their pronouns to a patient. So, I think that genetic counselors may choose not to share or ask pronouns to preserve that patient-provider relationship, but also sometimes to ensure their personal safety. So, we did, some of the responses to our open-ended question went into this, but we did not ask specific questions about that in our study.
But that's helpful to know, maybe just kind of even just in passing what some of the different reasons may be. And so you talked about asking those open-ended questions. So that I think probably played into looking at the different themes and doing the thematic analysis. So did you find other things kind of related to why genetic counselors might use gendered language and how it impacts their patient care?
Yeah. So when we did the thematic analysis, we found really 7 major themes. So the kind of first and the biggest one, a little over half, said, mirroring patient language was really the most common reason. So this motivation was really just like woven throughout all of the responses. Some of these were often coded to, other themes. We think about if patients are using gendered terms, creating this shared language can build rapport and trust. And then we did ask another question about what they thought, the impact of using gendered language was on the relationship. And the majority said that the impact really did depend on the patient. So several acknowledged negative impacts that it does have for transgender and non-binary patients. But they thought, even the majority was essentially not going to be harmed. The majority of patients are not transgender and non-binary. So they understood that there could be a harmful impact, but, that was one of their reasonings for not using that inclusive language. The kind of second theme that came out a lot, about 40% said it was for simplicity and clarity purposes. So a lot of people said, they had trouble with X-linked inheritance or with patients that maybe have lower health literacy or even language barriers. So some highlighted the importance of just really conveying this information that patients can understand. And that is, maybe gendered language or gender inclusive language. So that was kind of the second theme. The third theme was a lot of people said the majority felt familiar with it. So using this familiar language can increase comprehension, which was, said to be their main goal in an appointment. That kind of ties in with that simplicity, clarity theme. And then a few commented that their location of practice or somebody's, patient's ages or political views also contributed to their decision to use gendered language. I'm not sure how they know a patient's political views. Maybe it's more that location of practice. So kind of, again, familiar language. The other thing is they use gendered language. All specialties said this when sex assigned at birth is relevant for an accurate risk assessment, whether that's for management of specific cancer risks with inheritance patterns or when they're creating a pedigree. So if this information is necessary, I think kind of an implication of this, it's really going to be important that we clearly communicate why we are asking sex assigned at birth or these, body part questions with our transgender and non-binary patients so we can kind of mitigate that harm of using gendered language. Can also name body parts instead of associating those risks with gender, and then make sure we're using visual aids that are kind of representative of everybody. So kind of some things we can do to, address this important reason for using language that we need to be clear about. Some people indicated they adapt to their patients, so just kind of provider flexibility and providing personalized care. And then back to what we were just talking about 10% reported a negative response from patients when they were attempting to use inclusive language. So patients were getting uncomfortable when they were asked how they identified and, get some pushback. I did talk about this in my paper as well. There was another recent study that kind of supported this, showing that verbally providing and requesting pronouns can result in backlash with certain groups of patients. But they did find that providers wearing pronoun pins instead of verbally sharing or asking did not result in those negative reactions from those patients. And also non-cisgender patients had higher satisfaction and were more likely to go back to that provider. So maybe a pin can be really a neutral way, a subtle way for providers to show that inclusivity for patients. And then kind of the last theme, some just said they need to work on breaking habits and learning how to incorporate that inclusive language. So really just a habit and needing practice to do that.
So I think you covered, because my next question was going to be like some suggestions, right, for striking that balance between what the patient prefers, building that rapport, but also promoting, an inclusive practice. But I think you mentioned some good takeaways there, which is, thinking about something like using a pen that's maybe a little bit more subtle, but then also providing kind of the context, the why you're asking some of the things that you're asking, or you're using some of the language that you're using. Were there other suggestions or things that people mentioned in the survey responses that kind of, again, helped build that patient-provider trust, but that also remained supportive of kind of the language choices around gender and identity?
Yeah, some of the responses had some, again, kind of the reasons why they were doing this. And I think, cultivating these relationships is going to look different for every patient. And some people mentioned, it's really important to, build that relationship by being responsive to their emotions and reactions throughout that appointment, kind of assessing, how they're doing. And then that can also include adjusting language to match theirs. Now, of course, we don't want to adjust to match offensive language. We can just kind of maybe use that neutral language if someone says that. But we really do need to just break our habits and educate ourselves and get comfortable using gender inclusive language with patients when we need to do so. So I do think things like, things we use for all of our patients, like our intake and our health history forms, those patient handouts and resources, or clinic notes and visual aids can and should include inclusive language, but it's how we speak with patients in appointments that can be personalized. So I think that those are some things to think about. Gender inclusive language may not always mean gender neutral, but we do need to take care that we're not harming those patients and give them opportunities to disclose their identity or indicate kind of their preferences for inclusive language or not.
One of the things, too, that I think you pulled out from the study was that genetic counselors really wanted more training on gender inclusivity. And then some of them may have received it before, but some may not have. So I didn't know if you had any suggestions on additional training resources, either for people that are students or for people that are already out and practicing.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about a few of these, in my paper as well. I think for, practicing genetic counselors or even students and programs, if your employer is not offering this, if your program's not seeking out, your own education and training may be the only option. So some of those resources I mentioned in my paper, there's some online modules and workshops. One's called Amplify. that is focused on the cancer specialty, and then Amplify Sprouted, which is focused on prenatal. So these things could be used, by training programs or by practicing genetic counselors. And there's several more general, resources available, such as the Fenway Institute's, Health Education Center. Specifically in training programs, what I thought was kind of interesting, we found that those that had training in their genetic counseling program reported feeling more comfortable using gender inclusive language and sharing their pronouns. So prior to having this study data, I was on Gender-Affirming Care Committee during grad school with other genetic counselors, some of my classmates, program leadership. And one of our goals was to identify ways to improve gender-inclusive education and training within my program at UW-Madison. We felt some of the things we came up with, and we felt having exposure to these scenarios where you may need to use more gender-inclusive language could help students feel more comfortable with it when they begin practicing as a genetic counselor. So it's pretty neat to see the results from my study back up this, kind of hypothesis that we had. So our committee ended up suggesting a classmate of I, he did a lot of legwork on this, but suggested some simple changes to our standardized patient scenarios. So these changes included a patient that used they, them pronouns. So again, it's not like this big thing in these standardized patients, just everyday scenarios that is inclusive of all people. So getting practice using that. There was a patient that had a transgender twin in a cancer scenario to get practice on how to denote that on a pedigree and talk about body part risks. And then the previous class had also helped make some changes to our prenatal scenario that included a same-sex couple with a donor. So I think these things can all be, easily incorporated into other genetic counseling programs and their standardized patients as well. And maybe just simple ways to just get some experience before you encounter them in clinic.
And thinking of next steps, this was focused on the genetic counseling community, but what are some of the things from the study that you think would impact the broader healthcare community or other types of medical providers?
Yeah, I think a lot of these findings can be, applied to the broader healthcare system. If I had to guess, other providers probably have some similar reasons for not using inclusive language, but they also need to ensure that their patients are feeling supported and comfortable accessing that care they need. We know that transgender and non-binary patients face higher rates of discrimination in healthcare spaces, and they avoid getting care because of, they're scared of being mistreated. So I think clinics and providers of all types need to clearly indicate that they are inclusive and safe for all patients. So maybe that is wearing these pins to, have that subtle signal to patients. I do think all providers would benefit from mirroring patient language and kind of assessing emotions and reactions throughout their appointment and adjust as needed. So whatever that looks like for each patient. Patients are unlikely to follow recommendations from a provider that they feel that they cannot trust or that does not respect them. So if we want to improve health outcomes, using inclusive language, with our patients or with any patient is one way that we can easily start doing that.
And I honestly think that's an excellent point to end on, is that some of this has a direct impact to health outcomes. So I just want to thank you, Heather, for being here with us today. So this was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really, really good to talk about my research and maybe reach kind of a broader audience to hear about it.
Hi, this is Cal. My pronouns are she, her, and today I'm talking with Sarah Roth about their recent JOGC paper titled Experiences of Hereditary Cancer Care Among Transgender and Gender Diverse People. It's gender, it's cancer risk, it's everything. Sarah Roth is a genetic counselor and PhD candidate in anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. A BRCA1 carrier, Sarah's work explores the experiences of patients, communities, and providers navigating shifting social, ethical, and technological terrains in cancer care and genomic medicine. Sarah is a founding editor of Tendon at JHU's Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine. She is a contributing writer at Synapsis, a health humanities journal, and a recent pre-doctoral fellow in bioethics at the National Institutes of Health. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Cal. It's great to be here.
I am so excited to chat with you about your work today. So we're just going to get really into it. So the intersection of transgender and gender diverse identities and hereditary cancer is such an important one. Tell me a little bit about how you became interested in this topic.
Yeah. So I have a family history of breast and ovarian cancer, and as far back as I can remember, I've been interested in what the anthropologist Lachlan Jane calls the redoubling of femininity in cancer care. So all of the gendered reverberations that take place in cancer care. When my mom was first diagnosed with ovarian cancer back in 2014, I was a budding anthropologist, and a mentor recommended that I read Jane's article, Cancer Butch. And it really struck a chord with me. In it, Jane describes how when the feminist theorist Eve Sedgwick was diagnosed with breast cancer, Sedgwick said, "Ah, shit, I guess I must be a woman." And Jane's point in the article was that for queer people, this redoubling of femininity causes a kind of dis-ease for people living in bodies that rub against the dominant norms of the system. And I'm queer, and it resonated even at the time, just as a caregiver for my mom. Later on, when I was diagnosed with a BRCA1 mutation, and since then I've lived with cancer risk for the past 8 or so years, I entered into the orbit of cancer risk as well as the cancer community, and I started to see in much more granular detail just how the system really isn't built for queer and trans bodies. So then fast forward a few years later, I was training as a genetic counseling student and needed to pick a genetic counseling specific research topic. And this really came to the surface as one that was important to me on both a research level and also a sort of political and epistemological level. And then finally, on a subconscious level, I think as I set out to work on this project, I was looking to build community, connect with others, also navigating this journey.
I love that this is a topic that's not just intellectually stimulating for you, but also like deeply personal, which just brings another layer of meaning to all of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, for me as well.
Can you describe some of the specific challenges that TGD individuals face when accessing care, testing, and maybe more specifically genetic counseling as well?
Yeah, so some specific challenges that came up for folks were misgendering in the clinical encounter, also in notes and in family history forms, risk assessment and guidance based on cishet norms, as well as data drawn from presumed cis populations. So like from the SEER study and other national studies, gathering data about cancer risk and incidence, but not even asking participants for sexual orientation and gender identity and expression data. In the day-to-day though, just as in other healthcare settings, trans folks face discrimination, like ranging from the interpersonal to the legislative. I was looking at the ACLU tracker this morning and saw that there are 515 anti-trans bills at play right now. This shapes people's sense of safety going into care encounters. And a study that I often think about by James, published in 2016, showed that in the US, 33% of trans people at the time didn't see a doctor for lack of money, and 23% avoided seeking medical care for fear of being mistreated. And I'll also add that histories of medical marginalization have resulted in ongoing health disparities among gender diverse folks. And so trans folks tend to be diagnosed with cancer at later stages and also have higher mortality from cancer.
And I think that the intersectionality of, gender identities and then race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status just compound a lot of these themes that you're talking about. So with the idea that representation really matters, I noted that in the limitations of the paper, you talked about recruiting participants and the diversity of participants within the study. So how did you recruit participants, and what do you think are some of the best practices to ensure diversity within the TGD community of participants in research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll start just by reflecting back a seed I hear in the question, which is just to add that building on our prior discussion, experiences of intersecting marginalized identity really compound folks' experiences of stigma and discrimination. Trans feminine, people of color experience outsized experiences of medical marginalization in medical care settings. There's a lot of public health research on that topic in particular. And so just wanted to start by naming that, and also naming that in our study, we weren't able to recruit any trans feminine participants, and the vast majority of our participants were white and college educated. That's a major limitation of our study. But now I'll answer your question and tell you how we did recruit folks, which is namely through a few advocacy groups who work with the hereditary cancer community, FORCE, Facing Our Risk of Cancer Empowered, the Vassar Center for BRCA at Penn, and the Breasties. So these are patient advocacy organizations that both bring folks together, have initiatives for providing support to the queer and trans community, and are somewhat public-facing and clinically facing. And so we distributed screening surveys through these groups, and then also asked participants to share the screening survey with anyone who they thought might be interested, which is known as snowball sampling in qualitative research. In our study, we really wanted to foreground recruitment practices that built on trustworthy relationships. And we wanted to lay the groundwork, especially for these interviews that went deep with participants. We wanted to lay the groundwork for safe, trusting, collaborative research relationships. And this was one reason why we went through these advocacy groups, and also why I myself, as the student investigator, sort of worked as our study as a recruitment arm, distributing screening questionnaires to folks in peer support communities that I myself was already embedded in as a queer BRCA carrier. And so I think within the time constraints and the orientation towards community-based and trust-building recruitment practices, what we ended up with was a group of participants that more or less reflected the constituencies of the patient advocacy organizations through whom we recruited. So mostly white, mostly college educated, pretty young folks who were largely non-binary, genderqueer, and or transmasculine. And so I think with our study, to build towards a more diverse population, we could have, or could in the future, move iteratively between screening and interviews, just sort of taking our time to build towards a more diverse population, and also going beyond these advocacy groups that sort of served as the intimate recruitment hubs for our project. And I think in the future, especially as national data collection efforts integrate SOGI, so sexual orientation and gender identity and expression data, into their methodologies, it will become more possible to do this kind of research at a broader scale using the resources of institutions, organizations, and research collaborations that operate at a larger scale and are able to connect with more diverse populations. We did at the beginning of the study reach out to the folks at PrideNet. I think I also talked to someone at All of Us, and I was interested in connecting with them to form a research collaboration such that we could reach out and see about recruiting folks from from the population, from the country that they're trying to recruit diverse populations from. But none of that panned out. And again, I think that was due to a variety of reasons, but a big one being the time constraints of a short-term research project.
Tell me about the results. What are some of the common themes that emerged in your work?
We focused on 3 big themes that came through in interviews with folks. First, we discussed the difficulties that folks face navigating care as queer and trans people, especially given the gendering of oncology spaces and practices. We also explored how genetic diagnosis and gender affirmation journeys intertwined for participants and the complex emotional terrain of navigating them together. We touched on how for some participants, receiving a genetic diagnosis enabled them to overcome barriers to accessing gender-affirming care, especially in states where legislation is prohibiting the access of gender-affirming care or making it very difficult. On the other hand, for some participants, learning about cancer risk is also a burden and opens up uncertainties, anxieties, and unbidden forms of grief attached to primary and secondary losses connected to cancer in the family. And finally, we turned to participants' aspirations for hereditary cancer care, both drawing on concrete experiences that they have had of affirming or supportive care, and also just sort of their dreams and wishes for the field.
Yeah, that leads me to beautifully to my next question, which is, what strategies might have the participants propose to enhance the healthcare experience they received? How did participants express the impact of the gendered language, for example, on their health experiences? Kind of just scratching a little bit at that theme.
Yeah, totally. Interviewees really highlighted how the overt and sort of less overt gendering of oncology, so from pink ribbon campaigns to clinics named Center for Women's Care to the spaces themselves, sort of rife with both like concrete pink imagery and images of cisgender women smiling as they go through treatment. I don't know. All of these things create a real atmosphere of discomfort for folks as they physically pass through it, and also as they, symbolically pass through it. Something that folks also mentioned, and then I'll turn to your question about the strategies folks recommended, but they talked about how when they shared pronouns on intake forms and then were later misgendered in clinical encounters or in notes even, people used language like feeling let down, defeated, deflated. I feel like folks often, especially when they come in feeling like a clinic is going to be supportive or is making efforts to be gender inclusive, there's a real sense of being let down by concrete clinical encounters when that just doesn't happen, when follow-through doesn't happen. That said, folks often expect misattunement from providers, and interviewees discussed bracing for microaggressions. But yeah, as you mentioned and ask after, providers can do better, and participants made some concrete recommendations, including that clinicians not make cis heteronormative assumptions about their identities and desires, that they be careful with gendered language, that they express humility and transparency, especially after making a bumble or a mistake in a clinical encounter, and that clinicians really partner around difficult and complex care decisions and open up towards the patient to kind of explore together what a care plan could look like.
Yeah, so it sounds like, to summarize, paying attention, active listening, and two-way communication are really important in making patients feel like they're engaged and a part of their care, and that the provider really understands where they're coming from. As a provider yourself, as a genetic counselor, and based on the study findings, are there other actionable recommendations that you would propose for healthcare providers in general, whether they're in genomics or other departments, to really better support TGD individuals in their hereditary cancer journeys?
Yeah, so in direct encounters, we can share our pronouns and ask for the clients, convey allyship, with little tacit cues like a pin or a flag. We can also ask for input on the family tree in the case of genetic counselors who are making the family tree as part of the clinical encounter. Importantly, we can follow the client's lead on how they describe their body, and this is especially important for folks who are conducting clinical exams, like, say, breast oncologists, especially when there's physical contact involved. Following the lead on the client's language of the body is just so important, and also asking for consent when it comes to touch and consenting into that encounter. For genetic counselors in particular, I think we can use our skills and our unique training to listen compassionately, partner around really sensitive topics like dysphoria, and just practice a kind of radical humility that I know we are all able to access as part of our clinical care practices. And then I'll say that in the cancer or oncology context specifically, I think it's really important to ask clients open-ended questions, especially when contracting and getting to know a client. And for genetic counselors, we can do this. This is our bread and butter, but we can really turn towards the client with openness and curiosity when it comes to talking about their vision for gender affirmation or gender creativity, when it comes to exploring what brings them into the patient encounter, and when discussing and generating a care plan. I think turning towards a client in an open-ended fashion is really important. That said, especially given the legislative context that we discussed earlier, it's so important to understand that the clinic might not be a safe space for queer and trans clients, and they might not feel comfortable opening up. And that is okay too.
Yeah, I love the recommendations are applicable across multiple subspecialties and just medicine as a whole. So to just bring this all the way full circle, tell me in your words how this study impacts healthcare and the medical field broadly.
Firstly, I'll say I acknowledge, this is the product of a graduate student thesis. It's just one article, and as such, it's a drop in the bucket of healthcare research and even of healthcare research in the oncology space. But I'll say a little manifesto nonetheless. This article was published at a time where there's an overwhelming wave of legislation threatening to restrict or otherwise criminalize trans well-being, trans existence. At the same time, there's growing interest among some sectors of healthcare to illuminate trans needs and experiences and elevate trans voices. My hope with this little article, as part of that wave, or wave of growing interest, not of trans legislation, my hope is that this next generation of researchers and clinicians have, their feet on the ground, their heads in the clouds in a good way, envisioning both a present and a livable future that is safer for queer and trans folks, navigating care, but also just, living life.
Well said, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your research with me and the podcast. I'm really excited to see everything else that you do.
Thanks so much, Cal. Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm J9 Austin. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Genetic Counselling, which is proudly producing DNA Dialogues. For more information about this episode, visit dnadialogues.podbean.com, where you can also stream all episodes of the show. This same link is also in the show notes for easy access. Any questions, episode ideas, guest pitches, or comments can be sent into dnadialoguespodcast@gmail.com. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever it is that you listen. This helps us climb the charts and allow other people like you to discover the show. The DNA Dialogues team includes Naomi Wagner, Khalida Liaquat, Kate Wilson, DNA Today's Kira Dineen, and myself, J9 Austin. Thanks for listening to DNA Dialogues. Join us next time to explore the latest genetic counselling research.
For For more information about today's episode, visit dnatoday.com, where you can also stream all 200 plus episodes of the show, including video versions of interviews recorded in 2021 or later. Any questions, episode ideas, guest pitches, or sponsor inquiries can be sent into info@dnatoday.com. Be sure to follow us on social media, especially so you don't miss a giveaway. We are at DNA Today Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and more. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This truly helps us climb the charts and allow more genetic nerds like yourself to find the show. Here's a bonus. If you do and send us a screenshot, I'll give you a shout out on the show. DNA Today is created, hosted, and produced by myself, Kira Dineen. Our team includes communications lead, Corinne Merlino, video lead, Amanda Andrioli, outreach intern, Sonia Tanaiker, social media intern, Kajal Patel, and graphic designer, Ashlyn Anokian. Thanks for listening, and join us next time to discover new advances in the world of genetics.
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me are all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA.